Samson. What can you say about this guy? He's so stupid. He may have gotten strength from the Lord, but he certainly did not get wisdom. He was so blind, both figuratively and then later on, literally. He was singled out to be God's leader in Israel, but he couldn't seem to keep to his Nazirite vow. When he wasn't marrying heathen women, he was sleeping with prostitutes. He did nearly everything wrong, including the one really big thing, finally telling Delilah the secret of his strength. Why would he do that? Had he become so narcissistic that he believed his strength lay within himself and not in God? Regardless, once the hair on his head was cut, which was yet another violation of his Nazirite vow, he completely lost his strength. And finally, the Philistines had the opportunity to capture him. Oh, and you know, if you have been reading along in the book of Judges with us, the Philistines have been waiting for this moment for a very, very long time. They had an awful lot of revenge to get started on, so they gouged out Samson's eyes and took him captive. Now the interesting thing is that back in Judges 14, we were let in on what God was planning to do through Samson. He had been set apart as someone who would do a very special work for God, even before he was born. And I imagine that his parents were very pleased about that. So when Samson grew up and wanted to marry one of the heathen women, his father and mother replied, can I have the slide? Thank you. His father and mother replied, isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among all our people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? But Samson said to his father, get her for me. She's the right one for me. Oh, his parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel. God wanted to confront the Philistines, and Samson was his man. You remember all through this book that the special people God raises up to liberate the Israelites from their various bouts of bondage are referred to as the judges. So Samson was literally born to be God's latest judge, the man who would confront the Philistines. That was the original plan, but Samson couldn't manage to stay true to his calling. He was forever breaking his Nazirite vow and veering off script. So when it says that the Lord was going to use Samson's determination to marry this heathen girl as an occasion to confront the Philistines, who knows how God would have confronted them if Samson had stuck with the original plan. But okay, God would use Samson's quest for this woman to accomplish his purpose. But then Samson didn't even stay on that road. Who knows what would have happened if he'd never shot off his mouth at his wedding reception and then gone off on a killing rampage? We'll never know. But because of that, as we read about last week, Happy Mother's Day, Samson's wife was subsequently given in marriage to his best man, and none of that ended very well. However, just because Samson may not have followed the original plan, doesn't mean that God wasn't able to work through him. And in Judges 16, we see that Samson, even for all his philandering, came to the point where, in the end, he finally accomplished God's will for his life. He not only confronted the Philistine power structure, he demolished it, wiping out all the rulers of the Philistines in one fell swoop. And he did it in the house of their God, which was an even more devastating blow to the nation. Now, by that point, who knows how many plans God had to go through in order to accommodate all the detours Samson went off on. If plan A had been that Samson would be dedicated as a Nazirite and be faithful to his vow and to his God throughout the course of his life, who knows what plan Samson was on by the time he stood between the pillars of the temple that day and prayed to the Lord. He was certainly past plan B. Maybe plan R or plan X. Maybe he'd gone through the entire alphabet. But regardless of how many times God had to adjust the plan, his purposes were eventually realized. Were they not? And Samson is hailed as a hero of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. Think of that. This guy, a beacon of faith, a shining example of trust and confidence in God. God is certainly gracious to have included Samson in that list. Or maybe that's more of a commentary on the rest of the nation of Israel. Like, in general, they were so bad that people like Gideon and Jephthah and Samson actually were the heroes of faith in that time. The only ones God had to work with. And he did work with them and through them, didn't he? Reflecting on how God's purposes prevailed in Samson's life made me think of how God eventually accomplished his purpose for the nation of Israel as a whole, even though they weren't faithful to him. Because his purpose for them was to witness to others about their wonderful God, right? We've talked about that. They were supposed to become a light to the whole world of the power and wisdom and love of God. Originally, the plan was that they would do this through their interactions with the nations around them, since occupying the Promised Land would mean that all of the region's trade would have to pass right through their territory. But the Israelites never remained faithful to God long enough to exclusively occupy the land, let alone become a shining beacon of his truth. The closest they ever got was during the reign of Solomon, when peace largely prevailed and people from all over the world came to Israel to meet the wealthy and wise king. The Queen of Sheba was certainly impressed when she came, from wherever she came from. And all these visitors who came from distant lands returned home with stories of the wonders of Israel and Israel's God. But that didn't last very long. As the hundreds of wives Solomon married in order to form treaties with other nations soon carried his heart away from God, and the golden age of Israel was over. A rapid return to idolatry followed, and God's people were soon worse off than they'd ever been. And the light Israel was supposed to shine to the world went dark. It was clear God wasn't going to be able to accomplish his evangelistic purpose through his blessing and exalting of his people. So he was forced to accomplish his purpose through the opposite outcome for the Israelites. As they were eventually crushed by their enemies and carried off into captivity, the knowledge of the God of heaven through the faithful few who still served him spread throughout the heathen nations. Thus God was able to accomplish his purpose through the Israelites. They did become witnesses for God to peoples living in heathen lands, though they had opted for the much harder plan B instead of God's plan A. God preferred to accomplish his will through the glory and honor of Israel, so they could personally enjoy the blessings as they shared them with others. But Israel wouldn't cooperate. Instead of becoming this bright spotlight that God could draw all the heathen nations to, their light became so dim that only by scattering it throughout the heathen nations could it be dispersed to the world. But that came with so much more misery and unnecessary suffering for God's people. That was never his plan. Just like all the sin and suffering we see in the world today, people wonder how all this evil can exist when there's a loving God. But sin was never his plan. Adam and Eve plunged suffering when they joined forces with God's adversary in the garden, and we have all followed right in their footsteps. We're the ones who thrust God into suffering, not the other way around. But he has a plan to bring great good out of this evil mess. And that purpose will prevail no matter what we choose to do. Without a doubt, God's plan A will always be the best option because he only has the best interest of his creatures at heart. But if we're not interested in plan A, there will be other plans to follow, and God will continue to work with us until we arrive at a plan we're willing to participate in, even if it's a much harder road to travel than the one God originally designed. So while we may force ourselves down many difficult roads, it doesn't have to be that way. God's purposes are going to prevail, whether it's easy for us or hard for us. It was true in the case of Samson. It was true in the case of the Israelites, and it's also true for our own lives. God would much prefer that we choose the easiest path to go down, but he's not limited by our choice of a harder set of circumstances. He's such a genius that he can accomplish his purposes in any number of different scenarios. One of my all-time favorite Bible verses has always been Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, says the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you a future and a hope. I always thought that the plans meant a whole series of sequenced events intended to make my life into a sweeping, glorious tapestry from start to finish. And perhaps that's exactly what it means. Or maybe it means something more like this. I know the plans I have for you. Plan A, Plan B, Plan C, Plan D, and however many other plans we might need. I'm sure God hopes we'll get on board with Plan A. But even if we don't, I'm so glad that God is so flexible that he has many different ways to accomplish his will in our lives. If we choose not to take his Plan A, he doesn't get disgusted with us and stomp off in frustration. Instead, with infinite patience, he moves us on to Plan B. And if we reject that, he'll have something else up his sleeve. Hopefully, we'll learn a little more quickly than Samson did, and not have to endure as much heartache and grief as he did in the process. But even if we are as stubborn as he was, we can be assured that God's purposes will prevail in our lives. And in the end, we may even find that God has put up our name in the heroes of faith, Hall of